year at conferences, so people know each other. We're strict on having comparable data. So we have the same data for France and for Spain, for Argentina, for Texas, and so forth. But we're completely open in terms of theory and ideology. So we have people who are strong Marxists. We have people who are, Milton Friedmanites. We have people who are uninterested in politics, who don't care personally, but who want to study the role of politics. So we have people who are saying the strong state is what you need to solve the problem. Other people say no, the state is too big. We need a small. So we've got people who disagree. So we then say, okay, let's analyze it. So the kind of conversation that we're having right now with the two of you, we've had with each other for decades. And so we try to say, so as we listen to one another, and I get criticized just as much as everybody else. What if we did this instead? And then said, no, I don't think that'll work. But then I'll do it. So then we meet again 3 months later, and someone says, hey, I reanalyzed it the way I said you should do it, and I've shown you wrong. So that's happened again and again. Marty Lipset and I published a paper called "Our Social Class is Dying," which implicitly is one thing here, one question there. How strongly does social class explain voting or anything else? And so we had 10 years of debates. We had dozens of conferences. We have lots of people who were writing, publishing. We have over 100 papers, 4 or 5 books going on in this exchange. At the end of 10 years, we pulled it all together, and what's beautiful was many of the people changed their views, including me. That is, as we learn, if someone does a new paper and they say, hey, it's like this. This kind of thing. This is a completely new paradigm as to how crime works. So you see that kind of thing happening as smart people start working on these things and exchanging ideas with each other. It's wonderful. And so people change their views as we learn more. And so that's what I'm hoping to engender a little bit of here, that you can see how this happens and don't trust your instincts or what you read. Especially don't trust what you read or hear in the normal talk shows or media. You've seen enough to know that you've got all kinds of attitudes, views, interpretations going on in the media all the time. And how can we as social scientists do more than just argue? Okay. Anybody else have something they want to ask? Okay, let's talk about some of the specific cases on the reading list. I want to go through some of them and point out some big points here. This is now part 4, section on contrasting types of cities and leadership patterns. Barbara Furman, Challenging the Growth Machine. This is a very nice study. She was teaching at IIT. She came from Pennsylvania, and she worked a bit in Pittsburgh. So in the book, she contrasts 2 cities. It's a beautiful comparison of just 2 cities, but shows how you can address much bigger issues powerfully with just 2 cities. Okay. The simple point is, anybody looked at it and want to talk about it a little bit, or am I the only one? Yeah.
I just had a comment that reading it was interesting, because I'm from Pittsburgh.
Okay.
And so it was an interesting kind of comparison with my experiences.
Okay. Well, you want to tell us a little bit about the main points? And if it surprised you, all the better.
No, I think Pittsburgh's model of development following the collapse of the steel mills is unique compared to other cities that experienced a similar collapse. They were surprisingly able to recover, not rapidly, but effectively, and have completely transformed the city to rely on new forms of industry, particularly healthcare and technology.
Okay. Great. That's a bigger, longer-term thing. That's not her main point here. What does she say in the book? Or did you read it closely enough to see that?
I might need to remind myself. I read it accidentally last week instead of
Okay. Okay. Her big point is, for instance, and so let me ask it this way: Do we have declining steel mills in Chicago? Yes. Pittsburgh and Chicago were the two leading steel producing, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Gary, Indiana. Gary, Hammett, and South Chicago along there. These are the two largest steel production cities in the whole U.S. So in that sense, Pittsburgh and Chicago, in that narrow economic sense, have some. But in Pittsburgh, is the point, the way she frames it. People might talk about, say, they're declining steel mills in this neighborhood. What might we do to try to have a policy about either land use or better transit or retraining? That is, you could have 2 or 3 specific policies that might be raised to address the problem. And in Pittsburgh, she suggests, in general, people would keep talking about, say, training programs, and that might go to a committee that dealt with education or job training programs and so forth. It might deal with crime a little bit, but that is, the issue would be discussed in terms of that issue. If you deal with, say, lead or cleaning up the environment, you'd have green groups, you have committees in the city council, you'd have hearings that dealt with it in those terms. Okay, Pittsburgh. In Chicago, if you had the same issues raised, how would they be transformed or discussed? Her general point is that often, and this is more the traditional older Chicago model, but it still recurs in some issues some of the time with even Rahm Emanuel. Many of those specific issues get rebranded as race and power. So it doesn't matter if you start with job training or crime or whatever. It soon becomes, it's black versus white, it's rich versus poor, and it's you're the bad person and I'm the good person, and who has the power to deal with it. And so, so-and-so is mayor, is corrupt, he's taking bribes, he's doing the wrong thing, I'm against him. Or we're trying to follow reasonable policies, our websites are showing the progress we're making in terms of job training. So that is the political cultures of the two cities are drastically different. 1. 2, so she says, how can this happen? Answer 1 is political culture. Answer 2 is issue specificity, that is, be conscious of how different issues may shift, but how the dynamics of an issue is treated, such as I contrasted job training in the two cities, varies with the political culture of the city more generally. And then third, there are different resources which may come involved. So she gets into it a little bit, but but we can join this with a famous paper by Mario Small, when he was here, because Chicago is the most studied city in the world. I came to Chicago from New York because I wanted to study urban things. And New York, even though it's a bigger city and so forth, it had 1/10 the amount of serious research that you find in Chicago. I mean, Chicago is, people come to Chicago from Norway, from Hong Kong, because we have studied Chicago. People, not me, but economists, geographers, sociologists, political scientists have studied this city again and again and again. There's a massive amount of literature. So people come here to study these issues. Okay, so Mario Small did a paper and he said, is Chicago an average city and therefore a representative city in some way? And the bottom line is absolutely not. That is, the beauty of this city is it's not an so it's not representative. It's an outlier. It's an extreme case of lots of stuff. So the point, a more general point I'm making here is, if you're studying something like, say, the impact of income or race or a whole bunch of other stuff, you can have a scatter plot, say, of how cities or neighborhoods are located on these. Then, if you have something like a regression line for the whole U.S., or say all of Chicago or all of New York, you can say, is this one neighborhood down here or up here? Or you can also say, is it over here? That is it way off of the regression line? Is it a deviant? And the point is, Chicago is often way off the regression lines from the whole U.S. That is, Chicago is not representative. This is not Middletown. And, or put differently, we could probably say there is no Middletown. That is, it's fallacious to try to say any place is representative. That is, put differently, we can learn more by seeing great diversity by neighborhood, by cities, by countries, and then putting them together and comparing them. And so seeing, so for instance, I mean, the idea of having a very poor town, enough so that the NAACP says, yes, we're in favor of a prison, is probably a dramatic outlier compared to most other cities and most other local NAACPs. Okay. This is an African American National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It's an NAACP. Okay. So, quick general point. Try to locate the individual cases on something like a scatter plot of the whole U.S. or the whole world. But then, second, go use the individual case to, if it's, that is, for instance, in the case that you cited a case study. I mean, to know that that this was not a place where, say, blacks were opposed to it. What you're saying is at least, now maybe some black citizens were opposed to it. But the interesting point is the NAACP favored the prison. Says that, that says that the culture, at least, and probably the local NAACP talked to at least its leading black active citizens, and they then came to the conclusion that we feel this is a good thing to support. That says the town is an outlier. But we can understand general processes better by including outliers in that sort of analysis. Okay, so in that sense, Barbara Furman chose two outliers, you might think. On the other hand, they're not, if you look at the national patterns, both of them have a fair number of low-income people. They have traditional industries. They're both big steel. They both also had big political machines. They had lots of ethnic and racial conflicts, but they resolved them in different sorts of ways. Okay, so I'm making a couple of different points there. And this is the one most cited. This is the only paper with a reading with a star in this section. So anything else on Barbara Furman, because it's so nice, and because I'm also using it as we are with the study you're mentioning. What's the name of the author again?
John Easton. He got his PhD here.
E-A-S-O-N?
Yeah.
Not T, not Easton. Easton. E-A-S-O-N. John Easton. Okay, good. I'm illustrating the point that we can learn from good case studies as well as from citizen studies, as well as from mayor studies, and all of these are valuable for understanding urban processes. And if you use only one data source, you get a biased view. So try to check yourself by using, at least reading. There's not time. You can't do all of these things originally. But if you say, can I read someone who might have looked for a crime by point rather than by ward, and then you can get a different story. Okay. Anyone else have any questions, comments on Furman? All right, let's just go through some of the others for big points. Steve Elkin, City and Regime in the American Republic. This is on changes in Dallas business and reform government. Okay, I'd say that some of the Texas cities are dramatic outliers in the U.S. The one thing that Elkin points out, and there's also a study by Robert Lineberry on San Antonio. There's several other Texas cities that have been studied. One dramatic thing which they illustrate in terms of the big debate of business leadership and capitalism. That is, how much does capitalism lead to stronger businesses locally, and how much does having stronger businesses change the local political dynamics? Does it lead to having more conservative or distinctive policies in the city council? Okay, so Hunter's basic story for Atlanta was, yes, Capitalism drives businesses to be more powerful, and so the business elite drives the political decisions. And Clarence Stone made the same point. This is the main theme in our leadership section of the very first part of the course. And you turn on many of the media, and they still tell you this clearly. This is a fact. Okay, Hunter then was challenged by Dahl. Okay, and you know that general story. The next phase, however, was that these two case studies of Dallas versus New Haven can be compared. That is, we can try to compare them and say, is the researcher telling us something that's in his personal head? Is it his ideology that he's going around and finding people who tell him a business leadership story or a political leadership? Or are the cities themselves actually different? The better way to do that, or to answer that question, is to try to use comparable methods. And so we had, remember I put up on the board the traditional elitists, like the Italians, and then we had Dahl, Hunter, and then the comparative researchers. So the comparative researchers would go to Dallas, would go to New Haven, would go to Chicago and ask the same questions of the same kinds of informants, like the mayor, the head of the city editorial newspaper staff, and so forth, a Chamber of Commerce business leadership group. And then you can say how much is the city and how much is it the method. And the answer is you get much more powerful results if you ask directly comparable questions. And so point one. Point two, nevertheless, it also emerged clearly that some Texas cities had very strong business leadership, much more than, say, New Haven and places like New Haven. And so having some case studies of these strong business leadership cities shows, just as Chicago is an outlier, how business leadership did work in Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio in the past. What you had in several of them, and detailed here, for instance, is the business leadership would create a fund, money. They put in, millions of dollars and say, this money is to fund the city council members of the city. Then they would say explicitly, we, the business leadership, we like these 5 city council members. We're going to give you $5 million. Here are 5 other council member candidates. We don't like you. We're not going to give you any money, or we're going to fund people to try to eliminate you from office. We want to beat you. That is, the business leadership was openly, explicitly, directly involved, taking positions publicly, funding candidates in ways that in most other cities in the U.S., this is considered absolutely bad business. Okay? So the point is, having these studied, as Elkin does, is great to see. And so you don't need to imagine what might happen if the business leadership is actually doing this, because you also can see in other places where, and you can find the numbers. So I'm addressing sort of a very hot ideological issue. What is the role of business leadership in capitalism and so forth? And so there are many studies on this. And Elkin's personal position, as is the next one, Todd Swanstrom. Swanstrom, in a sense, is the opposite. In the sense that of choosing a non-Texas city. He chose Cleveland. And he chose the election of a populist, self-styled populist, poor-oriented two mayors, Kucinich and Voinovich. And Kucinich campaigned against the high cost of utilities. That is, the electric company was selling electricity to the citizens of Cleveland, and it was private, and the rates were going up and up and up, and people complain a lot in Chicago, for instance. It's an issue especially for low-income persons. He took a strong stand, and so he was elected, and he basically nationalized. That is, the city bought, took over the electric company, and the city government provided electricity to the citizens thereafter. And he tried to lower the cost of electricity. They basically were subsidizing these to some degree, although he tried to say, we're taking away the profits, that they're stealing money from poor people. We want to get so he made it a very ideological issue. After 2 or 3 years of this happening, a guy named Voinovich ran against him, who said, "This is bad management. You're raising taxes for all of the residents of Cleveland. You're driving away all kinds of taxpayers. You're subsidizing only electricity, and this is bad policy to subsidize just one thing in that way." And so he was elected mayor, and he beat the first guy. So seeing that is, I'm contrasting the Texas cities with Swanstrom, and I'm making a more general point. Both of them are somewhat leftist I think they're both political science. They both are very critical of what they're writing about, and their ideology is very explicit. The nice thing is they each have some contrast. So we have 2 mayors in Cleveland. We have I didn't stress it, but there also are changes over time. That is, the patterns that I described were followed in Texas cities for only about 10 or 15 years. Before they did not do that, and afterward they did not do that. One that I followed particularly closely was Houston, and let's raise this because Houston illustrates. Give a reading right on this. Well, let's use Rosdell. Don Rosdell has a book called "The Context of Radical Population in U.S. Cities." This is focused especially on only 4 or 5 cities in the whole U.S. that have the most radical populist mayors. And they were initially Santa Monica, and then a town in Vermont named Burlington. Who's from Burlington, Vermont? Anybody? Who ran in the Democratic primary against Hillary Clinton? Bernie Sanders. Okay, where's Bernie Sanders from?
Burlington, or Vermont.
Burlington, Vermont. I mean, I think he grew up in Brooklyn, came to the USC, went to the SSA. He was then mayor of Burlington, Vermont for many years, and he's included in detail as a major progressive left activist mayor. So there are 4 or 5 mayors in the country that really did this seriously for a number of years. So seeing how they did local politics and how different they were from others, again, makes this interesting because this is so different as were the Texas cities. So the point is, this is one of the beauties of studying policies in a local context, because when you go to the national level, everything is compromised. You've got to find something that people will vote on, and whereas if you go to the local level, you can find an NAACP locally that will support building a prison. Nationally, you'd never find that. That's why it's interesting. And similarly, Rosdell's pointing out some of these dramatic differences. I'll just mention in passing that we have a book on Chicago that I worked on. It's an oral history called Trees and Real Violins, Building Post-Industrial Chicago. We started it when Harold Washington was elected the first black mayor of Chicago in 1983-84. And I called up Bill Grimshaw, who was the campaign manager. Well, no, we'd had a couple of workshops here. We had candidates. We had Bill Grimshaw. We had Paul Green, who was the main policy advisor. Political. Could we maybe just close that door, please, because it's a little noisy there. Thanks very much. We had debates, and it was clear that it's near the end of class. Okay, we'll just end here and say it's available if we want to talk about it, but I've drawn on it in some of the examples that I've cited here. And then there's a paper I'll just point out as well. Barbara Furman, who we talked about first, co-authors the next paper with William Grimshaw, who was my collaborator because William Grimshaw and his wife Jackie were the campaign managers of Harold Washington. So they had connections, they had access to people that I never would have had. So when Harold Washington won the primary and then he won the general election, I called up Bill and I said, you know, this is the most studied city in the world. This is a major historic event. People say the politics of Chicago are explained by the mayor and by the machine. Harold Washington has broken those rules. He's beaten the machine. This is major. You ought to do a book on it. He said, no, I'm too busy. I called him back a month later and I said, Bill, you know, this is major. Why don't you reconsider? He said, well, I'll reconsider on one condition. I said, what's that? That you do it with me. He said, that's how I got involved. And so I tried to bring a bigger, broader interest in China and France and Yugoslavia, but also focus on Chicago. So as you can see, in some of the things that we're talking about. All right, we're at the end of the hour. We'll stop for now, but bring questions and let's continue on Monday. Yeah, we will not. I think it's now explicit in the